Welcome to this special bonus chapter of the Still Drivin Man, John Henry, The Untold Story of an American Legend audiobook. I'm Panama Jackson, narrator of the audiobook and columnist and culture commentator. The novel recounts the true story of the man behind the iconic American hero, John Henry, the mighty railroad man who could blast through rock faster than a steam drill. Using census data, penitentiary reports, and railroad company reports, the author, Scott Reynolds Nelson, reveals the poignant tale of a young Virginia convict who died working on one of the most dangerous enterprises of the time, the first rail route through the Appalachian Mountains. Today, we're talking with author Scott Reynolds Nelson himself about the writing of the book, the inspiration behind it, and the lessons learned about John Henry himself. Scott is an award-winning author and historian specializing in African American history, railroad history, and the history of commodities. He's taught at William & Mary and Leiden University and has been a research fellow at the EHESS in Paris, which I tried to nail down the pronunciation and I realized I could not. So I just decided to go with the EHESS in Paris, Harvard's Warren Center, and at the Newberry Library in Chicago. A Guggenheim Fellow in 2019 and 2020, he now teaches history at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. His latest book, Oceans of Grain, How American Wheat Remade the World, is out now. And of course, he's the author of Still Drivin Man, John Henry, The Untold Story of an American Legend, which is what we will be discussing today. So for starters, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on here. It's great to actually meet the person who has read my book. I listened to you deliver the book online, which was fantastic. And as I said before, I think your voice is now deeply inside my head. So,
Well, I appreciate that. That was it was a joy to do because I actually like the book, which helps everything. I like the book, so reading it out loud and narrating, I was like, oh, I actually got something out of it substantially. Now, so I want to ask, I guess, the most important question, the big question here. And I want to ask that in context of you specialize in African American history, railroad history, and the history of commodities, which is like a very unique intersection, especially even trying when writing a book about John Henry. Because I feel like all of the different components kind of meet in the middle somewhere here. So, what inspired you to write Still Drivin Man?
So in a way, it was entirely by accident. I had written a book called Iron Confederacies, which is a history of the Southern Railway. It was about how enslaved people had built what we call the Southern Railway from Richmond to Atlanta. And I was finishing it. My advisor said, you should write something about John Henry. He's one of the characters. He worked on one of the railroads that you study. And I remember John Henry. I grew up with it, grew up in Sanford, Florida, heard people sing sang the song myself. And I just figured, well, that's a legend. Like that's not a real person. So I dug a little bit deeper, and then I kind of stumbled on John Henry indirectly. So I thought he was just a made up character, but I knew the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and I had all of these sources that showed how the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad owned all the convicts in the Virginia Penitentiary from 1868 to 1872. And the event supposedly happened in 1870. And so I thought, So I then started to look through my material and realized that I had all of these clues about the person named John Henry, the person who had, with his hammer, built a tunnel through the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroads, a major tunnel through the Appalachian Mountains, and rebuilt the South. And so it was entirely by accident that I did this. I was looking at a postcard of the Virginia Penitentiary, listening to the song in my head, and this line says, they took John Henry to the White House and buried him in the sand. And the hair stood up in the back of my neck. And it's like, oh, that's where all the bodies were discovered in 1999. That's exactly, the song tells you where the bodies are buried, that all of these men who died building this tunnel, those are their bodies. And so that was the aha moment about like 3 months into it. But it was not what I planned to do. I was going to do another book on male friendships in Civil War prison camps. And John Henry just sort of became my life for about 4 years, just trying to figure out who he was, what his life was like. Where, how did this man end up where he was, and how did he rewrite the history of the South?
That's one of the more fascinating parts of the book for me because I grew up in the South. I'm familiar with the story of John Henry. I view him as a mythological figure, as most people probably do, as kind of as the story has been. He's a legend. But I also know him through comic books and like the retelling of the story through the Superman lens and, all of that. So there's all this pop culture, John Henry stuff that's there. So when I'm reading your book and I'm like, wow, this is really like, we're getting a real person here. Like this is a real person, kind of like Bo Jackson, the legend of Bo Jackson in sports and all this stuff like that.
Right.
Like people have stories about him that nobody can actually prove, but you can't disprove it and it seems possible. Right. So when you start telling the story, I thought it was interesting. And one of the parts I like about it so much was that your book is really, it's accessible, it's engaging. Like it's not just written as an academic text. It's actually written through the lens of your journey, of finding out this information, and through all the people involved and kind of part of that journey in telling the story and what you did, how you put the story together. So can you talk a little bit about your approach in balancing the academic and the narrative aspects of the book? Because, you kind of nailed the narrative nonfiction end of this thing where it's like, it's a fun read and it's educational at the same time. But that is a balancing act. So what was your approach? How did you land there in telling the story?
It's a great question. I think I've always wanted to be a writer. So I became a historian because I wanted to be a writer. I didn't start writing because I wanted to be a historian.
Oh, okay.
So history was the thing that I wanted to do because I love to write. And I'm a big consumer of fiction. I'm a big consumer of creative nonfiction. And I had to learn how to unlearn everything I had learned in graduate school when I wrote this book. Because in graduate school, I spoke to an agent. An agent contacted me about doing this book. Once I made these discoveries, it was in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and it was in, academics had heard about my discovery. And she said, well, tell me what your, I said, I don't think it's a book. I think it's an article. She said, well, if I had a gun to your head and you had to write a book about the story of John Henry, show me what the table of contents would be. And I said, chapter 1 would be about how difficult convict labor is. And chapter 2 would be, and she said, that's a terrible table of contents.
True. Also true, but yes. But yes.
Right. So I want to tell the story about convict labor, and I want to talk about the lease system, and I want to talk about Reconstruction. And she said, no. You want to tell us about the person and tell us about why you care. Right. And so the way to tell about why you care is to talk about your journey to the site where he died. Right? Your journey to the place where John Henry did this work. And when you describe it, people will follow you and they'll understand why you as an academic are so excited about this story. And when they sense your excitement, sense your passion for the topic, then you have them hooked. Don't start with how terrible life is for convicts.
You got to lead them there. You got to lead them there through the story, right?
You got to show them why you care about John Henry and why it matters to you that John Henry's story is the story of Reconstruction. It's a story of redemption. It's a story, and so that's basically how I ended up doing it. It was her guidance, Deidre's guidance, and writing that first chapter about myself it was really hard because we don't like to talk about ourselves. Historians, it's all about the books. It's all about, what we know and whatever. And so I had to kind of reveal my fascination with the past and why it is that I love to go down junk roads, and why it is that I love what about Black history and folklore, attracted me to the field. And that's hard stuff for us in the academic field. And so basically I broke all the rules of how I was supposed to write history when I wrote this book.
So you mentioned a bunch of different things I want to touch on there, but I kind of want to start with like how you wanted to start the book in general, like convict labor and all this stuff. I mean, the book it does start small. So I'm an opinion writer by trade. So I
Oh,
always
right.
do that. That's my thing. I start small, then I go big, and then I bring it back small. So I
Right.
explain to you why I care, and then why you should care, and then why I needed to tell this, or I needed to write this article or whatever. And you said this book became your life for like 4 years. It's because there's a lot of details. While you nailed the narrative nonfiction part, there's a ton of details and information, and you have census data, penitentiary reports, railroad company reports, like all of these different things that somebody like me would have no idea how to put together and synergize. But you're also talking about a time in history when records were not great. And like you're talking about that White House, even when you explained it in the book, I mean, there's got to be some guesswork and stuff there. There's a hope you're right aspect to some of this stuff that you're doing. Listen,
Yeah.
I worked in budget estimating for years. This is literally my life. So,
right.
What were some of the biggest challenges in trying to put this story together when compiling all these records that lost to time, lost to racism, lost to whatever, like all of those different components that come together?
Yeah, so the way I was trained is in social history. So that's not big political leaders, not not the people that everybody knows about, but how to look through a census and how to look through a newspaper, how to look through lots of very boring documents to try to find about regular people's lives. And so that part of it was familiar to me. And so I said, all right, how do I find John Henry? It's like a genealogist,
Okay.
All right, we need to find the name. Figure out how many John Henrys there are. There are 11 John Henrys in people with black men with a name, first name John, last name Henry, in all of the South, right? So it's actually a rare name at first.
Really?
Yeah. And so that part I was familiar with. The digging into some of those sources is still, I hate to say it, but it's still a pretty disturbing process. At the Library of Virginia, I wanted to look at the convict records, the penitentiary records. And so I went there, and they said I couldn't access them, that they were sealed. But
are there any reason for that, or they're just
no,
sealed?
They just none that they would tell me. And they told me. I said, what, we've got these. I found these records in London, and I found these records in California, but these records don't seem to be here in Richmond. And I said, why is that? And the head archivist said, oh, carpetbaggers, Yankee carpetbaggers. Those them and the scalawags, they just left everything all over, and it's like he could tell from my accent that I was not born in Virginia, and so he was prepared to tell me that it was my fault that the records were not there. So they were going to stonewall me about this, and finally I went back 3 or 4 times to a different archivist each time, and then the last time I was there, there was a woman there who was 35 years old, something like that, in her 30s. And I thought, oh, she's new. All right. She's been in another archive. She's not young. She's somebody who's got some years on her. She knows what archival work, and she's not part of this crew. And so I said, can I have access to the penitentiary records? And she said, no, looks like they're closed for public access. Why is it? It's public record how they go in. It's public record how they come out. It's public record what they do in the penitentiary. And she said, you're right. And she crossed it out, and she let me into the penitentiary records.
Wow.
And that's where I found prisoner number 397, John William Henry, sent out to the Big Bend, to the Lewis Tunnel on this date. And he's the head of a group of 10 people. And then all the other convicts that come in after him, people who were convict laborers in that system come after him. So that was a tough one. The others, the thing that I knew, the reason I kind of knew that I was right is that every time I made a guess, I found new sources, right?
Gotcha.
And so,
Okay.
I would make guesses that were wrong, right? And I wouldn't find new sources. But as I started to get closer and closer to John William Henry, a man born in New Jersey who ends up in Virginia, when I would find all of these new sources that would show me, oh, here's the Freedmen's Bureau records that are about him. Oh, and so I just felt like I was led in a way by the sources themselves, and that was an amazing journey, really.
So I would imagine you obviously had some knowledge about John Henry beforehand. Before digging in, you knew who John Henry was. Was there anything like really surprising to you that you found while you're doing this? It could be the whole story,
Yeah.
actually. The whole story might be
Yeah.
the answer to this question, but like anything particularly surprising or interesting? Because the New Jersey part of that was new for me, by the way. Like, well, I
Right.
guess all of it is too, but even the idea of starting there and ending up as this folklore legend in the South is an interesting trajectory, to say the least.
For me, the thing that made me think maybe I'm wrong about this is that this guy is 5 feet 1.25 inches tall, and so I was talking to a friend of mine who's studies mines in Potosi in South America, and he said, "Oh, no, people who dig tunnels are short. You need to be as short as possible because you're swinging the hammer above your head and going in, and you're powerful, but you're small because the channel hole is dug by one person, and then you use explosions to get further in. So every miner who does hard rock mining in the side of a mountain is a small man, because otherwise the hole is too big and it takes forever. So that surprised me, and then it took me a while to kind of figure out why. There's 200 men who died building that tunnel. The men between the ages of 18 and 25, all dead, right? So the bones of 200 black men are buried in these boxes. And why talk about just one person? Why is John Henry the person? Why not these 200 men? Why not this? And and I think it was because he was from New Jersey. He spoke differently from everybody else who was there. I looked
Mm,
at where everybody else was from. Almost all of them were from Virginia, and many of them from Eastern Virginia. And so he would have stood out. And it was clear from some of the records that he was somebody who, I got the impression that this is somebody who was standing up for himself, but had no one else to stand up for him. And so I think all eyes were on him, even though everybody died. Almost everybody died over the space of 5 years building that tunnel.
wow.
And so I that to me was, I could say, all right, so this is a short man from New Jersey who has not been a slave, right? And so that's the other thing, is that for black men who had been enslaved and were then in this penitentiary in 1870, here was somebody who stood out because he spoke differently and probably dealt with the guards differently and probably was a kind of heroic character, to a certain extent, even though, of course, he dies after finishing his hammer work.
Right. So the book comes out in 2006. Do people beat down your door with new hey, by the way, I have this thing about John Henry, I got this thing, has been new discoveries, information? I don't know, are you being called to do the part 2? Is there a sequel on the way? Like, what happens when you drop when this book comes out? What new discoveries happen post publication?
Not too many. I was contacted by some people who were in prison, who
Okay.
were interested in the story of John Henry. I was contacted by prisoners' rights people who admired the story, and a story about somebody who's not, who's committed a small crime and ends up in prison, which is a life sentence. That this is, if he committed a crime, it's for basically shoplifting, and it gets rewritten into this. And one of the things I discovered from these prisoners' rights people is this is a lot of people in
Right.
penitentiaries now, right?
Yeah.
Is that this story that I see is, I'm pointing out that it's a minor crime that ends up being a major. That's not different in 1870 and today. That you can do something that's very minor, and because of the way that sentencing works, because of the way that bail works, um, you can end up in prison and die in prison, for a minor thing. So that was news to me. That was, I mean, I kind of knew, but and so Black Lives Matter, the prison pipeline, that stuff came after 2008, and so
Right.
I was becoming educated about that as it was going on. And so since the book has come out, I learned more and more from other scholars about how perfectly ordinary this situation is. One of the things that I said is that the black codes never go away in Virginia,
Right.
right? That there are black codes created in 1866 to punish black people and put them in penitentiaries. And I spoke to Heather Thompson, who wrote a book about Attica, and she said this is every state. This is not just Virginia. This is not just the South. That, these things are on the books in 1866, and this is how we end up with lots and lots of people in high security prisons for minor crimes.
Yeah, it's a little sobering that
Yeah,
the same story in different centuries can still kind of persist.
yeah. 150
Yeah,
years later, we're now, and this is still, it's the rules of justice. Rules of evidence change. The Civil Rights Act, which was overturned in 1870s, gets reinstated in the 1960s. I don't want to suggest that there's been no progress in terms
right.
of the rights of prisoners, but it still can happen that for minor crimes you can end up, or minor infractions, you can
Yeah,
end up in a serving hard time.
yeah. How you get there might be different, but the results tend to be mirrors in some cases, I guess is the
Right, and if you work backwards from people who are sometimes in penitentiary,
right.
we're not talking about murderers. We're not talking about rapists. We're talking about people who sometimes commit very small crimes.
So the book comes out. It's been 17 years now. That's 26 to 2023. Were there any challenges or criticisms of the book, about the research and interpretations of it? I imagine there would be. I read a couple articles about, when it was released, I guess book reviews, which is interesting because as a not academic text, but not like fiction book, like it was, it's a narrative nonfiction.
Right.
I read a couple reviews and I was like, oh, interesting. Like this framing the myth is still a myth kind of thing. Like, so, what was that part like? What were the challenges like to the research interpretations and stuff like that?
So the one that you could probably find if you Google a little bit is this professor, chemistry professor at University of Georgia, which is now where I teach. But he had wanted to create a John Henry theme park in West Virginia at the Big Bend Tunnel, and but
Okay.
what was involved in it somehow. And he hadn't done any real research on his own. So I had looked in all these sources, but he was just working on the internet. And he had this theory that John Henry came from West Virginia. He settled in the Big Bend Tunnel, and is basically piecing together some other work that other people had done. No real individual research on his own. And so I felt like he wanted me to debate him, and that's what. So there was a little bit of that. But as he's finishing, he said, "Well, the further I think about this, the further I think you're actually right." So he wrote me a letter, and he said, "I think you're actually right." And he said, "One of the things I discovered is that the White House of the Virginia Penitentiary, they called it the White House in Richmond." So, uh, so it was a little, that was, and he said, if you and I write an article together to show that your research is right and my research is wrong, then I'm willing to. And I said, well, I've got another project to do. I'm not gonna keep doing that. So my harshest critic ended up on my side on that. There were critics who were historians who said, and I was writing that review in my head, who the hell is this guy talking about his own life, talking about his own experience, why he's interested in John Henry? Um, I was writing that in my head for the Journal of American History or American Historical Review, and
Hmm.
it took about 2 years, and then finally somebody did write that review that said, basically he's breaking all the rules, he's breaking all the history rules by talking about why he's interested in John Henry and not leading us all the way through from beginning to end and proving it without a shadow of a doubt. I have thought about doing an article as I found stuff, more things that kind of fill in the gaps, but I life is short, and I have other kind of books in my head. So no, by and large, the reaction has been great because you can't, if you go back over those sources, I give all of my sources.
Right.
Uh,
It's very
it's
thorough.
so historians are like, my book is still regularly assigned in classes for a couple of reasons. One, because of the kinds of sources I use, and two, because I talk about what I know and what I don't know, and most historians don't do that. They tell you what they know, but they don't tell you what they're guessing. And I tell you what I'm guessing, what I think might be the case. He could have been working for clearing bones in Petersburg. He could have been on strike in that period when a bunch of railroad workers were on strike. but I can't say for sure. And that kind of humility, I suppose, is something that we don't usually do, historians. We pick the argument, we run with it, and we don't tell any we don't suggest what we might be wrong about.
Which is interesting because I think that makes it a more compelling book, as opposed to, especially in today's day and age. If you think about, I mean, I know this was written in 2006, but so many more history books are being told from first person perspectives, that they're adding, it's not just history anymore, it's what the history means.
Right.
It's all the other stuff now. There's a lot more of that in terms of the way people, maybe it's the Daily Show effect, right? Where it's not just the news now, it's like, how do we feel about the news? That, that kind of thing, where people are more interested in what the stories mean as opposed to here's just the fact. Which is why even when I read this, I'm reading it from that lens, and that's where I am. And I'm like, this is great. Like, I get to understand why the impetus, I understand the driver. And I think that always helps perspective, right? That's what, people always talk about perspective lends so much. So I think I like that. So I think it's funny that to your community of historians, it's breaking all the rules. And I think the laymen are like, this is great. At least I understand why we're doing it. Why am I here in the first place? Like, why am I here? That's an important question for a lot of us now. Is there anything you would have done differently or approached differently now? Like, would you approach things in a different way?
Yeah, I think I might have talked a little bit more about the modern ramifications of it. I think I tend to think about things in the 19th century as being in the 19th century, 1800s, and so the school to prison pipeline was something that I think I would have talked about. I think there were part of what I tried to do is not talk so much directly about race in quite the same way that people talk about it now. One of the things I tried to suggest is, why would John Henry not have had allies? Other people, did get out of prison for on some of these trumped up charges. And my experience, my thought about this was that it was because he was a foreigner, because he was from New Jersey.
Yeah, right. Yep.
Also, there are other things, a light-skinned black man in Virginia who doesn't talk, to people the way that other people talk to people, who speaks to people more directly, more bluntly, looks them in the eye when he speaks to them in a way that people who had lived under slavery were not expected to do. I was, some of that I didn't talk about, but I should have speculated a little bit more about that, because that, the word Jim Crow emerges in 1866 in Virginia. But it's built around a kind of idea about what people who had formerly been enslaved were treated. So and there's some language, we tend to talk about enslaved people rather than slaves. There's some language that I'm somewhat uncomfortable with now, going back 20 years, but it was, or 18 years, but it was I was using the language of the time. There are ways in which I would have told that story. Convict is usually not used as a word as a noun anymore. We talk about people who are convicted or people who are in prison.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that, but I think it's a product of its time, and so I feel like I've learned, how to tell that story differently. But it's the book that I wrote in 2006 that has its own shape, I think.
Yes, so it's so crazy to think of something post 2000 as being of its time. Like, just the idea that it's just,
Right.
like, you're right, you're completely right. But even just thinking about that, it's like, man, that was, that's not even 20 years ago. But that book, like, we have changed so much of the language that we use for certain reasons, and for this is crazy. Like, that's how fast. It's kind of a marker for how fast time moves and how fast norms and things can change because of what's going on in society. So it's really fascinating to think about in that sense. Speaking of change, though, so one of the things that you just pointed this out that I think is fascinating is that John Henry was a short man, very strong, light-skinned man from like New Jersey, this thing. But the way we know him in pop culture is like Shaq, right? Like, it's a completely different, it's a completely different version of the historical record but the way that he looms in pop culture and media, like what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we get there? I mean, like, obviously myth making and things like that lend to it, but how do we go from, I guess, the fact that most people probably don't know to this is the lasting image of John Henry?
Right. I mean, there's so much of popular culture that had changed too, I think. And so one of the things that changes, I think, after John Henry dies is so I grew up in Sanford, a mostly black town then in the 60s and 70s. There was one movie theater. It only showed blaxploitation films. I'm visibly white. I obviously stood out when I went to these movies as just about the only white person in the audience. And I think the idea of the bad black man comes out of those blaxploitation films, right? Shaft, Sweet Sweetback Badass Song, and so and that actually has an older history. It goes to the 1880s and 1890s. The idea of a
Right.
man who is dangerous, right, and who does not put up with any shit from anybody, and the man who's got two pistols, in his hand, and so I think that there's a kind of performance of black masculinity that gets accelerated in the kind of blaxploitation films. Black Panther, right, has a little bit of that, pulls a little bit from that idea of the powerful black man who's has a totally different, way of interacting with others. So that framework is a framework that I think that would have been very confusing to John Henry himself, right? Who is himself probably less deferential than many other black men, but there are different kinds of stereotypes that we have sometimes, and we recognize them as stereotypes
Right.
for black masculinity now, and in different times, and thankfully there's a variety, right? It's not just one uh, you know, type of thing. But I think he fits into a different kind of box, which is the powerful black man who doesn't put up with anything and is dangerous and somewhat frightening. And as as that's much better than
It's definitely not a
many.
5'1" light skinned black man from from New Jersey. No
Right,
matter how
right.
strong he is or how good he is with a hammer, it's definitely not that.
Right.
'Cause-
Yeah. So I appreciate because I love blaxploitation films growing up in Sanford. I appreciate and love that image, but it's also an image that I recognize as a stereotype. It's an image that people try to live up to.
So the book spends a lot of time focused on the Ballad of John Henry, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
was very fascinating to me because this is a song I've heard of. It's been covered by who knows how many people.
Mm-hmm.
Reading the different versions and reading them out loud and all this, seeing the different versions and the way that the song has evolved into this pop culture staple, a cover for a ton of bands and things like that. Like, what do you think it is about that song and that ballad that has grown over time that has captivated like American culture specifically? I mean, because I really feel like it's almost like a
Right.
American cultural song.
He's a kind of paragon character, right?
Yes, that's a good word.
Yeah. Part of it is, to defeat a steam. You and I could have defeated a steam drill in 1870 and 1871. So back when it happened, steam drills were bulky and they, but but by the 1880s and 1890s, and particularly after 1900, the idea of defeating a steam drill seems impossible, right? Who could possibly do that? So
Mm,
in some sense, he's kind of the muscles get added later because in your imagination, defeating a steam drill seems impossible. But he's in this. I think he's also in this world where human power, doesn't matter as much anymore. So we go from world of wood and water to world of steam and steel, and steam power starts to replace human and horsepower right around the time that John Henry dies. And
okay.
so he represents this change that happens. And then I think, he's important for black people in the post-war period. He's the Samson kind of character. So people who grew up with their
Definitely, very
Bible,
much so.
right?
Yes.
And Samson is very, just like Noah, a really important a character in the Black Church and things like that. Also, it's this idea of kind of hidden injury that's distinctive. It's funny. It's interesting to me that miners who die at work in large numbers and textile workers who die from the little bits of dust that float around in around them and makes them cough and ultimately kills them from brown lung. That this idea that you're going to work alongside this machine and the machine is going to kill you is, I think, something that's really, really resonates. You know, that so it's more than just a hero. It's also somebody who predicts his death in every line. Right before I let the steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Looking at his papa's knee, he said, "Steam drill is going to be the death of me." Every line he predicts that he's going to die, and so there's something about that ballad structure that's very moving. That's about a powerful
Right.
person, but also about the inevitability of death, and the fact that it's an unavenged wrong. And I think, to me, that's an interesting thing. And it says something interesting about Americans, that we talk about heroes, but unavenged wrongs are the songs that we sing. And it's the most recorded folk song. And I think that that's partly the reason, not because he's some heroic character, but because he knows that they're going to get him.
Yeah, even just the idea of labor markets and just not being succumbing to
Yeah.
the system that makes all of its money off of you, and
Mm-hmm.
you
Right.
still die in the end, but you're going to take the ability to rise up and take on the machine
Uh-huh.
and win
Right.
that one time. That, I mean, it's interestingly very resonant. I mean, it's resonant now. The idea just of, you know, we are better than this. You're not going to take everything from me. I might lose in the end, but I have my dignity. There's obviously I'm not like a specialist in labor unions and all this stuff, but
Yeah.
just I
Yeah.
could
No,
just
you're right.
imagine how that could be powerful. The idea
Absolutely.
of, we're a country where we want to work, but we're forced into work in order to have to meet the bare minimum kind of thing. So the idea that the system is always going to win, but there's that one time when it didn't.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
good story. It's a compelling story.
It reminds me, Carl, the Communist Party was fascinated by John Henry, and they're the ones who really, I can help spread it around in New York and Cleveland and places like that, where the Communist Party is small, but they're big in particular cities. And yeah, they say Karl Marx's Capital is very abstract, that story, but the story is a person alone will be killed by capital. And so they say that the story of John Henry is what you do when you're on your own, is why you need a union. It's why you need your brothers around you. That's why you need to work together. And so theirs is a slightly different take on that, but it's very much about labor and about the labor that defines us and ultimately, I suppose, is going to kill us.
I think people like John Henry, he has loomed large in the pop cultural sense in various ways. I mean, people make movies, the stories want to persist, the song, there's all these, the pop culture of John Henry is strong. What do you think people should take away from the story of John Henry? Because again, even though I think he looms
Yeah.
large in a pop cultural sense, the true story is kind of not the one that people are focused on. The true story is not
Right.
one that I think most people know. They know this mythological figure who
Right.
took on the
Right.
steam drill and won to his detriment. They know that. So, what do you think people should know about John Henry or take away from this story? And what should pop culture get right about that story?
The reason it's transmitted by railroad workers, people who line and reline tracks, is it sets a pace, and it sets a slow pace, and it's a story to people that if you work too hard, this will kill you. And so I say that, I think the last two lines I say, and you say in the book, are slow down, right? And part of that is, don't let them set your pace, right?
I like that.
Because that's what John Henry did. Is he allowed them to set his pace, and it killed him. And and so, I think, in fact, the trackliners had the story that they were conveying to each other is, you need to slow down, you need to take care, you need to be careful, because your life is on the line, kind of. Um I so i so i do still think that slow down is an important part of this. And the steam drill that's now we face is in our heads. right? Am I doing enough? Am I hustling enough? Am I do I do everything that I have to do to make everyone happy? And that steam drill is locked in here. And you know, anxiety and fear that you're not doing enough, and a sense of failure and all that other sort of stuff. It's how capitalism works, I think.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. I was gonna
and
say
it's
capitalism at its finest.
right. And so we need to stop that steam drill, right? We don't fight it, just stop it, right? And so part of, I think, to me, that story is we're always going to be anxious about our ability to do things. And what John Henry did was he pushed himself past his limit. And so it's a caution to all of us about pushing ourselves too hard. And the steam engine is now no longer a physical thing. It's AI. It's all of these other things that are supposed to be replacing us. And rather than working twice as fast, we need to think about how to stop it.
That's a great point, and it's a great way to bring this conversation, to an end. Thank you so much for this
Let me just
talk
say, it's
about
so
the book.
great to talk to you. I know your voice so well because I heard the entire thing, So I think when I'm thinking to myself now, I have your voice in my head, which is, having heard
That's hilarious.
205 pages of that, and so it's so. I mean, and you did such an amazing job
Thank
of
you.
telling that story. I can't tell you how excited I was that this version was done, and to have you do it was dream come true. So
I
thank you
really
so much for
appreciate
that.
that because, again, like I said, you never know how people are going to take. Like, this is your art, your words. You hope you do a good job. That's ultimately your hope you do a good job. So I'm glad to know that. To you, I did a good job. That's good to know. So you have a book now. Do you have any
Oh,
other projects, or you want to plug books? You have what do you have going on? What's going on in the world of Scott Reynolds Nelson? It seems like you have a lot going on. You
yeah.
write books all the time and stuff like that. It seems like. So what's going on?
So I wrote this book called Oceans of Grain, which is about comparing the United States and Russia, competing to provide food to the world from 1789 to 1917. So they were basically both competing to feed Europe. And I finished the book in 2021. And when I finished it, I said, the Russian Empire depended on Ukraine, and the Russia will never be a world power again unless it controls Ukraine. The book came out 2 days before Putin's invasion.
Oh,
And
wow.
so people thought I predicted the invasion. I didn't, but I said, Ukraine's too important to Russia for it to. So that was the Oceans of Grain book, and it's been translated into 9 languages, and that's been fascinating. I've been asked to write the Chinese introduction. It sold tens of thousands of copies all over the world. So that's more straight up economic history, and the difference between serfdom in Russia and slavery in the South, and how those two things power that world. But the new book I'm thinking of is called Oceans of Drugs, and it's about the creation of the Atlantic slave trade.
Oh, wow.
Coffee, sugar, tobacco, cocoa, the 4 commodities that Europeans decide are so valuable that they need to be produced in the Caribbean islands. And they create an Atlantic slave trade to bring millions of people, 10 million people from Africa to the Caribbean, work them until they die. And many of them die childless. And to create these drugs that basically power what we call civilization in Europe. Coffee keeps us awake. Sugar provides us energy. Tobacco and caffeine are stimulants that keep us in one direction. And so that's it's very early days, but I'm interested in
Wow.
that big story.
I am too. I mean, you sold me. Listen, you have sold me on that one. That has sounded fascinating, actually. So listen, this was great. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing the book, which is, again, titled Still Drivin Man, John Henry, The Untold Story of an American Legend. And make sure you check out that audiobook written by Scott Reynolds Nelson, narrated by myself, Panama Jackson, available wherever you get your audiobooks. Special thanks to the team of Marginal Media Works who produced the audiobook: Sanjay Sharma, Milan Chakraborty, Brian Aguilar and Sterling Shore. Scott Reynolds Nelson is the author. My name is Panama Jackson. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.